Well, welcome everyone. We are so glad that you are here. Um, we've got, I can't remember the exact number of people who registered, but we have seen some folks not be able to join. So I say we get started and we'll go with the conversation now. And then as more people join, we'll just let them into the presentation. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for Building an Adaptable Culture. Presented by Marty Lattman, class of 1974, a fantastic alum who shared so much with especially the alumni office, but also me personally over the course of the last several years. And we are just, we were talking earlier about how timely this topic is, especially given COVID that happened almost a year ago for all of our organizations, no matter what industry you work in. To think about how do you adapt, how do you pivot, how do you innovate at a time that's high stress and you're trying to figure out a lot of things and yet be able to capitalize on that innovation. And so I am confident that you are going to very much enjoy Marty's presentation here tonight. If you want to ask some questions, you can certainly do that in the chat feature. Feel free to put those in there and then we'll get to them as we go throughout the program. If there's something that pertains directly to what Marty is talking about, I'll interrupt him and ask that question, but we'll keep folks on mute just so that we can streamline things. And with that, I will turn it over to Marty. We are recording, so we will send this out afterwards so you can rewatch it or tap into the knowledge that Marty is sharing. And with that, we'll turn it over to Marty. Thank you so much for doing this. And we're really excited for this evening.
Well, thank you, Tom. And let me, excuse me, first give out I guess young people call it a shout out. So I'd like to give a shout out to Tom and his team for orchestrating this. It's incredibly innovative. I'm not aware of any other colleges doing this. And it's been exceptionally well managed the entire process. So they deserve a lot of credit. So I just want to make sure everybody's ready. You have your Worcester alumni drinking cups, hopefully. I have water in mine. So just full disclosure. So we're going to talk about building an adaptable culture. Obviously, that's the topic. And before I define it, actually, I'd like to tell you a quick story. So I'm going to actually flip back for a second. So this was about 4 years ago, and I was asked to give what was essentially a keynote about adaptability. And this was to a group of 100 salespeople in a hotel ballroom. And the young lady who was setting this whole thing up gave me the 4 o'clock time slot. And the happy hour for these 100 salespeople was at 5 o'clock. So I said jokingly, "You don't actually think anybody's going to be paying attention, do you?" She goes, "Oh, I think you'll be fine." So I was immediately presented with a challenge of how am I going to get their attention? Because obviously, they had other thoughts in mind. With all due respect for sales, my son is in sales. It's an essential function and discipline, but they had other priorities. So I thought long and hard about, what's a good way to get their attention right from the get-go. So obviously my title slide says adaptability. And I decided that my first slide said nothing but Eastman Kodak. And my second slide said nothing but Blockbuster Video. That got their attention real quickly. It you could literally see them all of a sudden stop talking to each other and look up, because those are pretty vivid, stark examples of iconic American corporations that failed to adapt. And there's lots of reasons, well documented, but those are, again, noteworthy examples of what happens when you don't adapt. So that's just kind of a little aside. So I think the question of, do you need to adapt? I think it answers itself. And there's an interesting little acronym that I think applies to why it's even more important these days than ever before. And the acronym is called STEEP. So the S stands for socio-demographic. The T stands for technological. The 2 E's are economic and environmental. And the P is political. And basically, or political, regulatory, whatever you want to call it, legal. But the point is, those describe the different forces that cause dynamics in any given industry or space. And they're in various combinations, they ebb and flow over time, they evolve. But if you look at those 5 parameters, they are changing more rapidly and more substantially than at any time. And so that's increased complexity, and you have a shorter window to respond. And that's why it's even more important these days to be adaptable. So that's a useful, I guess, model or tool if you're trying to identify what the driving forces are that will require you to adapt. Okay, so let's define adaptability. I think the first and foremost, you have to recognize when a change is needed. Clearly, Kodak and Blockbuster did not. You want to identify alternatives. I mean, you're going to have kind of your initial instinct, your gut reaction, and many times that will end up being optimal. But it's good to come up with a couple alternatives before you decide. Then you make rational, well thought out decisions. You should be clear on what criteria you are using to make those decisions. You want to be as quick as possible, but speed is not an absolute, because speed, if by itself with no other considerations, can be damaging. So you need to be as quick as possible, and yet at the same time be conscious of the other factors. So there are various synonyms that people use when we're talking about adaptability. I think the 2 that are garnering the most attention these days in all the leadership literature are agile and resilient. So agile, brings to mind, someone who's a good athlete, for example. Resilient, obviously, the ability to bounce back. I think versatility is pretty important, because one of the things I've learned over the years is the more different situations you've been in, the more different environments you've worked in, the more different challenges you've faced, the more likely you are to adapt to a new situation. You've dealt with it before. You've had some failures and successes. You've learned from the failures. You've developed confidence as a result of the successes. So I encourage people to, always welcome new challenges and try to, insert yourself in as many different situations as you can. Adaptability is ultimately both a mindset and a skill. It begins with a mindset. Without that, you won't develop the skills. But it's hard to develop those skills without the proper mindset. I think the other thing that's very important, Tom and I were chatting about this before the call, is that people tend to think of adaptability for organizations as a whole, and certainly that is the case. However, they can certainly teams and departments can become more adaptable, and so can individuals. And the steps, the processes, the methodologies are fairly uniform across those 3. Obviously, when you're doing an entire organization, it's much more complex, but there's a lot of similarities. So again, and we're going to talk more about the fact that it's a mindset and a skill, but while we're having our discussion, you want to be thinking about, do I want to start with myself? Do I want to roll this out to a team? I know that Tom is interested in having his team, work through this at some point. But just kind of think about what perspective you want to use as we go through this. So why is it essential? These are some questions to ask that should kind of invoke, yes, now I see why it's essential. So what happens if you don't change? We've already talked about that. And you've all heard the expression, the only constant is change. And as I mentioned earlier, change is happening more rapidly and in a more difficult way than ever before. It's increasing complexity, less predictable. That's another challenge is who saw COVID coming? And if you don't feel the need and don't make an effort to evolve and improve, where's the innovation come from? What happens is you accept and embrace status quo. And when that's the case, you're not going to be as inclined to question your situation, to look for new opportunities. And when that happens, that typically suppresses growth in many respects. So the ultimate question, which of course always gets asked, is can adaptability be learned? The answer is yes. Can it be measured? Yes. And we're going to go through all those things because there are a number of fallacies about adaptability, which I think are a major reason why it hasn't been embraced by as many organizations as it had. As it has. A lot of organizations talk about adaptability, but when you take off the roof and say, what are you actually doing to make yourself more adaptable? There's not much there. And I think that's because they don't think it's measurable. They don't know if there's a process by which you can implement it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. That's really why we're here. And just one other point to make. I don't know if you've heard of the term CL&I, which is continuous learning and improvement, but that is an incredibly important cultural attribute. They talk a lot about learning organizations, and all the Good to Great books talk about the fact that the organizations that have this learning, constant learning mentality, they're developing their people, they're giving them new opportunities. Those are the ones that are more successful and that people like working for better. They're the best places to work, is that learning mentality. So I call it continuous learning and improvement. And I think that there is no endpoint. That is a lifelong journey for individuals and organizations. Because if you at some point decide you're as good as you can be, you become complacent. And we all know what happens when you become complacent, because your competitors and other people will not, and then you're left behind. So I think that's very important. So let me elaborate a little on what adaptability means within this whole kind of organizational context, regardless of the type of organization it is: corporation, private sector, public sector, academic, nonprofit, doesn't matter. So the main thing is attitude towards change. That's where this whole mindset comes in. And there's kind of a continuum where on one extreme, you've got total resistance to change. And on the other extreme, you have people that welcome and embrace change. They see change as opportunity. They're constantly looking for new ways to evolve and grow. Most organizations are somewhere in between, because the ones that are way on the change resistant end are probably having a very, very, very tough time now. And it's really hard to build and sustain a culture where everybody buys into embracing change. It takes time. But if you hire the right people and you constantly reinforce that mindset, that could certainly happen. The other thing is, you could tell a lot about an organization's attitude by what I call their systemic risk appetite. There are certain businesses and institutions that simply have no appetite for it. They don't want to, they think there's too much risk. Tom gave a wonderful example before we got on the call about his undergrad alma mater, basically identifying an opportunity to move outside their traditional liberal arts model to add a new revenue stream, and it's been tremendously successful, and it was pretty darn innovative. And because they weren't afraid to take a risk, because they didn't know for certain that it would be successful. So it can certainly be done. Another way of assessing the adaptability of a given organization is the processes that are in place or are not in place. And I'm going to tell you in a few slides how important having a process is for becoming more adaptable. And a lot of the things I'm reading these days about leadership development, there's a very big emphasis on process and methodology. They don't want it to be too academic, too theoretical. They really say, okay, well, tell me how to get this done. They want practical. As you can imagine, and as I'm sure many of you have experienced, you don't want to assume that adaptability is uniform across an entire enterprise or organization. It varies by team. It varies by individual. I think that's natural. Do you want it to be uniform? That's a nice goal, but certain people are going to be inherently more inclined to be that way. Others are just, for whatever reasons, it's not as much in their comfort zone. But you could certainly move everyone in that direction, and that's, I think, the goal. One of the myths we're going to talk about later is that only the top leaders can really influence adaptability, and in the broader sense, culture. Sure, they will generally have more ability to impact that. However, certainly at an individual level, if you decide you want to become more adaptable, I can't imagine that your team or your manager or your organization would want to stop that. Almost everyone I talk to says, yes, we need to be more adaptable. So as long as you do it within the accepted norms of where you work, I think most people will admire that, commend that, and you may become quite an influencer. I think that's definitely the case. And what's so interesting is that everybody talks about it, and yet again, so few organizations actually have these processes in place or assess how adaptable they are or try to measure it. They just believe that can't be done. And the reason I always hear when I ask is like, well, we're too busy with other things, or well, we don't think it's really going to change anything. And how do you measure it? These are the things I hear all the time. So again, my objective here today is to show you a way to do that, to kind of overcome that stagnation that a lot of these companies feel because they just don't think it's possible. So I made the point that the proper mentality is absolutely critical. It does start with that. So attitude is everything, but you do need, as I said, a step-by-step process that outlines and describes how you implement it with an organization. And then what happens is, as the process is implemented, you are enhancing the skills. And when those skills become more and more embedded, that's when you move the needle to become more and more of an adaptable organization. I think it's incredibly important to understand that adaptability is an integral part of your culture. So although the focus today is on adaptability, it is within the context, the broader context of organizational culture, which, as I'm sure all of you know, is one of the hottest topics there is these days in organizational development, leadership, training, et cetera. Great quote from Peter Drucker: culture eats strategy for breakfast. You could have the best products of the world, the best people, all that stuff. But if your culture is flawed, I mean, there's so many examples of companies with great cultures who do remarkably well, and then ones with toxic cultures. Kind of a good example of a toxic culture would be Uber. I mean, they had an ingenious idea. They were a disruptor in the greatest sense, but very toxic culture. Got lawsuits like crazy from former employees. It's just, culture can really, really have a negative impact. But then you've got ones like, unfortunately, the founder just passed away. Is it Zappos, the shoes? I think it's called Tony C, or I don't know how you pronounce his name. But what if, I've never bought from there, but everybody I know, my daughter loves the place. She buys all her shoes there. So apparently they do a wonderful job with customer service. So, and say what you will about Amazon, they are very customer service oriented as well. So makes a big difference. Now, I believe that culture essentially is mindset plus processes. So I'm going to go back to my emphasis on processes, because we're talking about adaptability. People say, well, is there a process for it? I'm posing that there is. So we're going to work through that shortly. And when there's a process, typically it's easier to have metrics. It's pretty hard to have metrics and baselines and things like that if there's no process. So when you've got step by step and you have milestones and you establish metrics, et cetera, that makes it a lot easier to achieve results, to measure your progress, to evaluate where you can improve, things of that nature. So can adaptability be measured? Yes. Can culture be measured? I believe the answer is yes. And I also think that it can be molded. So I'm a huge fan of this concept of molding. The term I like to use is a conducive culture. So you want to mold a conducive culture. And by that, I mean one that enables the organization to succeed in whatever way it wants to succeed. That's why I use the word conducive. And, every organization has different things that are important, values and goals, et cetera. But you want a culture that enables those to be achieved. That's pretty important. Now, just as kind of a quick side note, and this is something that I've not formally studied. I've just, it's been something that has fascinated me for a long time. And that is, what's the optimal number of steps in a process? You'll see some that are 3 or 4, those are very easy to remember. And then you'll see some that are 15 or 20, which are obviously not easy to remember. My theory, and I've had some people validate this, is the optimal process is 5 to 7 steps. And that's because it's enough to have distinct, milestones and a logical flow, but it's not so many that it's overwhelming. So, it's just my opinion, but I believe the best processes are 5 to 7 steps, and that seems to strike the right balance between ease of implementation, but having enough depth to actually represent, a lot of different things. Okay, so let's talk about some sample processes that relate to adaptability.
Hey, Marty.
One of them is lessons learned.
Hey, Marty, can I jump in real quick?
Please,
Would you like to launch the poll asking folks how they see their culture, their organization, and how adaptable that is, or do you want to wait until the end?
Nah, let's do it, Tom. Do it.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to launch this poll. So you should get something that pops up on your screen on a scale of 1 to 10. How adaptable do you think your organization is currently? With 1 being very low and 10 being, highly adaptive. It'd be interesting to see your results. So feel free to submit those. Hopefully you all see them.
So Tom, you realize that all your people are going to say that Department of Alumni Affairs at the College of Worcester is a 10.
Well, I certainly hope so. No, I think hopefully we get some honest, there's some 8s.
I'm just kidding.
kidding.
Just kidding. Can you scroll that down a little, Tom? Because I'm only seeing 1 to 8 or 1 to
mostly 8s, 10s. And then the second question is the barriers. So Marty.
So mostly 8 to 10s already? That's interesting.
Yeah. So it looks like 8, 9, and 10. So
there's somebody being honest saying 6.
Oh, there we go.
Because you know what, Tom? I'll tell you. I mean, I shouldn't I'll wait till you're done, and then I'll tell you what I've seen from other folks. So some 4s, some 6s, some 7s.
Yep.
The vast majority of responses I see are between 4 and 7, which is what you expect in the middle. Don't see very many 8s or 9s.
Yeah, and then
at least that's been my experience.
Question, which is about the barriers. So systemic resistance, institutional confidence, market or industry is too vital, and over reliant on past success, which is what we were talking about earlier with Kodak, being too over reliant. Okay, so looks like everyone has submitted, so we'll end the poll there. Those are our poll questions for the night, and Marty will share it back over to you.
Okay, did you want to have them do the other poll now, Tom, or?
It looks like it did both of them at once, Marty. So
I did not. That's okay. I did not see the multiple choice one.
Do you see the second one there, the biggest barriers?
No, that I do not see. I see the 1 to 10 scale.
Okay. So I'll read them to you. It says it's sharing, but so the biggest barriers we've got.
Let me do stop share results. Would that do it? Should I hit that?
You might be able to. It might take it away for everyone.
Okay, then I won't touch it. So yeah, go ahead. Just summarize for me.
So it looks like the biggest barriers are systemic resistance. So getting into process, lack of institutional confidence, maybe in delivering those processes.
Okay.
The industry is too vital. And then lastly, overly reliant on past successes. So
that's Kodak and Blockbuster.
Yep. So
all right. So those responses were fairly balanced then, right? In other words, they were across the board.
Yeah, for sure. I'll turn it back over
to you.
Makes
sense. Okay. Okay. So thanks for doing that. Can you take that down? Because that's blocking my slide. Or should I do that on my screen?
Yeah, you know what? You might have to do it on your screen because I turned it off on mine.
Okay. Good. All right. Very good. So everybody can still see the slide, right? So one of the things that's fascinating is that I worked for a number of companies that we do this big complex project. When it was all done, said, oh, let's get together and have a lessons learned discussion. So we'd sit around a conference room and we talk about what worked, what didn't, what we could maybe do differently the next time. And not once was it ever documented or put in some kind of a database where people who were not involved in the project could access it, learn from it. So it was almost like, why'd we even bother? And I think it's very important that I'm a huge fan of this concept of, and this is a mouthful, cumulative institutional knowledge. Try to say that 5 times fast. Cumulative institutional knowledge. It's one of the greatest assets any organization can have. And it's basically what works for us, what doesn't, those kinds of things. And you build that up over time. And again, you want to manage it as an asset. So if you treat it as an asset or resource, you need some kind of database or some kind of system whereby people who are not directly involved in something can go in and do a keyword search and find out about it. So that's an example of a process that I see very few organizations embracing. Another one is what I call process audits, and this is Captain Obvious, but the processes that cause the most problems within organizations are cross-functional. So it's not within your department or within your team. It's when there's collaboration required, because then it gets into a question of roles and responsibilities. And well, I thought you were doing, those kinds of things. So I think it's a good idea when you detect that things are broken, and even when they're not, is let's go back and audit this and see if there's some different way to do this. There's the famous story, which I think it was actually true, that back in the day, I guess this was in the 90s, it took 38 signatures at General Motors to get a single rivet changed in the design of a car. 38 signatures. That's I think more than apocryphal. That was in the book of one of their former CEOs. Just, the bureaucracy was unbelievable. And they wondered why it took them 7-8 years to get a new car out. So had they done a process audit, I think they would have pretty quickly determined that, why do we need 38 people to sign off on this? Makes no sense. And the key there with this whole process audit thing is you want to be more responsive, and this is an important point, of course, to your external customers, but you have to think of your fellow employees as internal customers. So if somebody in a different department at Worcester asks alumni affairs for help with something, or vice versa, they become your internal customer. And you need to treat them pretty much the same way as external in terms of being responsive, in terms of ensuring that you provided them the information they needed, things like that. Companies or organizations that have an internal customer mentality seem to always outperform the ones that don't. And that's a very important cultural attribute, I think. So I believe that adaptability should also be part of everyone's performance review. Okay, if you really want to make the point that this is incredibly important for the future of our organization, it's right there. And this is what's going to partially determine your merit increase or your promotability, whatever. And another example of a process that I just don't see very often, and the excuse is, well, our industry is changing too fast, is that there is a team of people whose responsibility is to analyze competition on a regular basis, look for vulnerabilities, look for opportunities to leverage a strength you may have, but it's keeping your head on a swivel and just having your ear to the marketplace in terms of competition. Way back when, many years ago, in my first job at Xerox in Rochester, there was a whole department, and they had engineers and they had analysts, and the engineers would basically buy competitive copiers and reverse engineer them. Not sure how legal that was, but that's what they did. And then the analysts would go in there and they would measure things like how long from the time you put a piece of paper in till the first copy came out. That was called FCOT, which is first copy out time. I mean, they are into minutia that would blow your mind. But we knew every competitive copier manufacturer. We knew every single little technical detail, and for marketing and sales, they would put these together in nice little matrices and stuff to use as marketing and sales tools. Tremendously valuable. And you just don't see very many organizations doing it. And I think it's very useful. Okay. Let's see what happened to my page up, page down. Let's try that again. There we go. Okay. So what are some, I mentioned earlier, these common fallacies about culture. And then of course, you know, the adaptability gets folded in here. So culture is an ethereal concept. That's a Worcester educated word for squishy. It's something you can't get your hands around. Can't be defined, can't really be measured. A lot of people say, you know, culture is what it is. You can't really change it. And, you know, even when you get a new CEO or new senior management team, sometimes, you know, they can't really change it. And in a lot of cases, that's true. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't make the efforts, because that's a self-defeating proposition. Another one is that you can't really analyze culture. So there's a lot of nice buzzwords of this is what we want our culture to be, and these are our values, but can you really analyze that? So again, the whole purpose of our discussion tonight is that I'm going to say, well, actually, we can do these things. Another one, which I touched on previously, only top executives can actually influence culture. Again, at a departmental level, you could certainly have impact, and with yourself, you can. The other thing is, you know, some people I talk to say, well, you know, it's really about profitability if you're in the private sector, and does culture really affect that? And, you know, if you got the right products, blah, 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 that's what matters most. We already talked about that. That culture is a huge, huge determinant of the success of an organization across the board. I think that's kind of increasingly people are realizing that's the case. Okay, so let's talk about the process. And you'll note that it happens to be 6 steps. So I adhered to my own theory. First one is you have to know where you are as an organization. Again, this could be enterprise-wide, departmental, but where are we right now? That's your baseline. And you know, is it a little bit subjective? Yes, but you still use ratings like we did a little while ago with the poll that Tom showed. At least you know where you are so you can evaluate progress. You then want to summarize your conclusions and findings and insights from that self-assessment. The next thing you want to do is create a vision. I have a very distinct definition of vision, which I will share with you. There's a lot of different definitions of it, and I just think that the way I define it, and I'm not unique in that, is the most effective. So we'll walk through that. And because you have to have a vision in order to be able to articulate, here's the kind of culture we want to have. So you want to have a vision for your culture, and in turn, adaptability becomes a piece of that. So once you have this vision, you need an actual roadmap to get there. You need steps within that. You need milestones, you need metrics, etc. So I like the term roadmap versus plan, because it specifically says this is how we will get to our destination. Then, and this is another theory I have, everybody that I talk to says, well, you know, we want to have plans, we want to make a decision, and then we want to execute. You go, okay, I get that. But isn't there a phase in between, which I call implementation, which is to get people ready to execute? Because the people that are actually doing the execution may not have been involved in any of the analysis and decision making. So if you just foist upon them, okay, we're going to do this, they're like, what's this about? Why are we doing this? And people are not going to buy in and be motivated if they haven't had it explained to them. So to me, implementation is the training, the explanation, and the preparing of people to execute successfully. So I like to use that term. And then the final step, when you're getting into execution itself, you have to be tracking your progress. You want to have some kind of a regular reporting of metrics, etc. And you want to evaluate your progress. You know, how are we doing? Should we make any changes, or should we give it more time? So we'll talk about each of these. So with a self-assessment, so if you're doing it for an entire enterprise, it can be pretty much of an effort. So you want to have a kind of a plan for that. The one-page plan is fine, but it's basically, okay, here's how we're going to do this assessment. Who's going to be responsible, who's going to design it, or we're going to show it to senior management. How will we actually let people, provide their responses? That's what you want to include in your one-page plan. I think it's important that people feel they can be candid. So if you need to do blind surveys, Survey Monkey, whatever, that's probably a better way to go. Sometimes focus groups in addition. I think ideally you do both, but people need to feel like they can be honest. And one of the things you want to have is what I call adaptability indicators, because they are what will enable you to intelligently assess exactly how adaptable we really are. And the nice thing about adaptability indicators, and we'll talk about these, is they provide for metrics. So once you have an adaptability indicator, metrics are associated with those. Another thing that can be pretty darn interesting, and Tom was talking prior to us getting started about 360 degree leadership, et cetera, et cetera. So what a department thinks about itself in terms of adaptability and what other departments think of them could be pretty interesting. I would want to know that. I like to think my team is pretty flexible. We listen, we try to be responsive. And then some other department goes, your people never call me back. I was like, really? That's news to me. I'd want to know that. So I hope that's not the case, but you never know. So I think in your plan, you probably want to address how are we going to share feedback and see what comes of that. Because again, I think that could be useful. Next step is key findings. So you're going to establish a baseline using as many metrics as you can within your survey, your self-assessment. But you have to know, here's where we're starting and here's where we want to go. And again, the more you can quantify that, the better. And you want to establish goals, as you would expect. How many of you have heard the acronym SMART goals? Okay, good to know that people know what that is. Again, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. Personally, I think the M and T are the most important. I have clients who say, oh, well, we've got a SMART goal. We want to improve customer satisfaction. I go, okay, is that tomorrow or in 10 years? And then I get a blank look. So there's got to be a T in there. Okay, and by how much? You want to have one person put on your website they like you, or do you want to have your ratings go up from 3.5 to 4.9 on a scale of 1 to 5? You got to be specific. So good. I'm glad everyone knows SMART goals. And then beyond these metrics, which again, as I mentioned, are tied to your adaptability indicators, what is this self-assessment telling us? And where it really gets interesting is looking at the root causes for why you are where you are. So those folks who said they were only a 4 or maybe a 6, why is that? The more you understand, the better. There will probably be multiple factors. Sometimes it's just the history of the company, the legacy. Sometimes it's what are the best practices. It could be the economic climate. There's a lot of different contributing factors. But the more you understand those, the better off you'll be. I think it's useful. Okay, next steps. So here's where I'd like to talk about vision. And my definition is a very simple 3-word one, which is desired future state. And let me contrast that with mission, because I talk to people all the time about their mission and vision, and you would be amazed how many people get those confused. So to me, the 3-word definition of mission is why you exist. So your mission shouldn't be about you. It should be about whoever you serve. Because you exist to add value to whoever your constituents are, students, alum, whatever, for Worcester. Okay, so your mission, that's why you exist, to add value. Your vision can be about you, which essentially means if we fulfill our mission, we will achieve this glorious future state. And to me, a vision is like it's a guiding light. You hear northern light, beacon, touchstone. But the nice thing about it is once it's defined and people understand it, your strategic decisions are going to not be ad hoc. They're going to make sense because they're all designed towards getting us to where we want to go. So you're no longer making strategic decisions in a vacuum. There's a framework by which you do them. And furthermore, it lets you establish priorities, because the question you should always be asking is, why are we doing this? And if you're doing something, some major activity that's got everybody running around like crazy, go, wait a minute, how does this align with our mission and how does this contribute to our vision? And if the answer is, I don't know, you shouldn't be doing it. And I'm always amazed how many organizations, when I ask that, they go, and I can tell they're like, wow. And they go back and have some interesting conversations when we're done. So I think it's very important to understand that vision is not the same as a goal, because a vision, I don't know if you could see it, it should be asymptotic. So if you majored in econ or math at Worcester, you probably know what that means. If you majored in philosophy or sociology, I'm guessing you don't. Now, I cheated because I majored in philosophy, but my mother was a math teacher. So asymptotic is you can see a graph and it's going down a curve down from the top left to the lower right along the x-axis, but it never quite gets to the bottom of the x-axis. It kind of flattens out and is just a little bit above that x-axis. That's what asymptotic means. What's my point? That you never quite get to your vision. You get closer and closer. But if you think you got there, then you're complacent. So it goes back to the continuous learning and improvement. And if you embrace CL&I, you never quite achieve your vision, but you achieve goals. And those move you closer and closer to your vision. So that's why I always start with vision first, and then your SMART goals derive from your vision. So one of the things that I think has proven very, very helpful for folks that I like to do with a lot of clients is they'll say, okay, well, we hear you. Yeah, we got to define our culture. But how do you do that? Is there some simple way to get our arms around that? So I think there is. And the answer is that you want to identify 5 or 6 attributes. And here's the way you want to do it. You first want to get people to say, what's our culture currently? And typically, and you want to try as best you can to conform to this, you got to limit them to 6 attributes or descriptors. So they'll come up with 20, but you got to make people vote and get it down to 6. And you want to have 4 positive, 2 negative. You can't be all 6 wonderful. And if you have 6 negative, then you probably want to update your resume. You want to be 4 and 2 is a good balance. And that's how most organizations are. The easiest way is 1-word descriptors, because you want people to be able to remember them and you want to be able to talk through them and discuss them, et cetera, et cetera. And the way this little model works is after you've defined current, you say, okay, we're going to keep the 4 good ones. So we'll keep an eye on them, but basically we don't have to make those a priority because those are already entrenched. We need to fix the 2 ones that are not good. And we need to add several more that we don't have at all that we think would be useful. So you take the 2 that you're going to fix plus maybe 3 or 4 new good ones. That becomes your vision, your desired future state, because the underlying assumption is the existing 4 good ones remain in place. So I can give you a couple examples. So one of the negatives I hear incredibly often is exactly what we're talking about this evening. We're not adaptable. People are resistant to change. We're not flexible. We're not resilient. That is probably one of the top 2 things I hear. Another one I hear very frequently is we're not strategic. Everybody's focused on what they have to do today. We never look beyond 90 days. We're never thinking long term. We're never thinking big picture. And of course, the explanation is we're too busy. But I think at some point that's very detrimental. And I'm not saying you sit around all day thinking 10 years out, But when you're determining your near-term priorities, they have to be aimed at whatever your long-term goals are. Otherwise, you're just wasting your precious time, and nobody has enough resources. So you can't afford to be investing in projects that are not ultimately going to provide a long-term benefit. And as a country, we are very, very short-term oriented compared to certain other cultures. We take a much longer view of things. So the whole idea here is just when you've got this desired culture, it's kind of telling employees this is what we think are the right values, behavioral priorities, however you want to call it, and it's not intended to be too overly prescriptive, but it tells people this is kind of what's important. And you have to avoid making this a perfunctory exercise, because I say this only half jokingly. One of the core values and key attributes for Enron was integrity. I rest my case. So the point is, make it something that's applicable, that people go, yeah, that resonates. I like it. I can buy into that. So don't just do the whole buzzwords thing. Make them unique to your organization and distinctive. So we'll touch on that at the end, Tom. I think we want to parking lot that, and maybe at the end have some people, come up with some maybe new attributes or descriptors they'd like to see, type of thing. That's a good exercise. Okay, so the next step is creating a roadmap. And again, you want to start with a vision, and then come up with these adaptability indicators that I mentioned earlier. I think 5 or 6 is about the right number. You want to have a goal for each. And I think so you can track your progress on an ongoing basis. You want to have quarterly milestones. I don't think you need necessarily to do monthly, but I don't think you want to wait a year either, because you want to have continuous progress. And the whole point is, once you've defined your vision, say, okay, how are we going to get there? And that's where those adaptability indicators, and then whatever other attributes you're hoping to develop further, would come into play. Now, manageability is very important in something like this. It can be very complex, and you're already busy with tons of other things. So for each of your goals, I think you max 3 initiatives or action items. Don't overload. Okay, we're going to do all 50 things. People are just going to get very turned off and overwhelmed right away. You'll lose momentum. It won't go anywhere. So limit it to 2 or 3, and you can do it in phases. Get a couple successes under your belt, builds confidence, builds momentum, and I think that phased approach is a good way to go. And when you're kind of diagramming all this out, some initiatives can apply to multiple goals. So you don't have to have 3 times 6, 18 initiatives. You could have maybe a total of 10, which different people would have responsibility for. That can typically work. All right, so I want to give you some examples of adaptability indicators. And the first one is, and these are things that organizations just don't measure. Now, some may have a general sense of these, and it can be difficult to have precise measures for these, and you don't need to be precise, but you need to have a decent estimate, because you want to have the baseline and then see how much progress you're making, as I said. So how much time does it take to make a major investment decision? When does Worcester, how long does it take Worcester to decide they're going to, create a new building or refurbish or remodel, like you did with Cow, a few years back? From the time that's identified till we're doing this, we're going to get the funding, whatever. How long does that take? Because you'd be amazed how many companies I talk to where, oh, well, we're very decisive. I go, okay, then how long did it take you to actually implement and execute? That's when I get the blank stare. So that's another adaptability indicator. Okay, you made the decision. How long till you actually got something done? So 2 different things, but related. So in this example, let's say there are the average you've determined is 5.3 months from the time that you developed the concept or identified the concept. Hey, maybe we should have a new, like you did the new chemistry building, till we got the funding approved. and you say, you know what, we'd like to get that to 3 months. 5.3 months is too long. Obviously, it's complex, and so it's going to take 3 months, but we could certainly improve from 5.3 months. Okay. So, what would be some examples of initiatives associated with that in order to get you from 5.3 to 3 months? One would be to actually define the process for making the decision, because so often the decisions are, there's no commonality, there's no structure to how that happens. They just kind of unfold. It's not clear who should be involved, and as a result, they're inefficient. And if you have standard templates for each of these steps, preferably one pagers, I'm a big fan of one pagers, then people know this is what's expected, this is a deliverable each step of the way. And if we adhere to this process, we'll cut down the time significantly. Another is to actually have a team of people designated to manage the process, because different investments will probably require different teams of people. Now, I know Worcester is very collaborative, and so I know that Tom's team works with the faculty, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're talking, maybe most institutions are not as organized and systematic in how those decisions are made as Worcester is. And then the other thing is, what are the go no go criteria when you're trying to make this decision? My opinion is you want to have 3 or 4, no more than 5 criteria. You obviously want to look at cost. You want to look at impact, but of course you need to define impact. You need to look at risk, et cetera. You want to have, again, 3 to 5 criteria, and you want to use those consistently for all major decisions, because those become embedded within the organization as these are the things we need to look for. And then the process gets streamlined because people are working on getting those defined as part of the process. So when the meetings are held, the information is available. That just improves efficiency all the way around the board. Okay, let's try another one. This one, I just don't see very many organizations that have invested in doing this formally. And so the availability indicator is actually proactively analyzing industry trends. Again, keeping your ear to the ground. What's going on out there? I like to use the sports analogy of head on a swivel. So you talk to different organizations and go, well, oh yeah, we do that. They go, okay, great. Who's responsible? Then you get your blank stare. They go, oh, well, how often do you review this? Blank stare. So I'm kind of hearing you don't really do it. Oh, okay, I guess you're right. So it's another thing that has to be a defined process. And so a goal would be to actually, establish that, document it. If it's not documented, sorry, people aren't going to know. And we want to roll it out within 4 months. It's going to take time. We're busy with other things. If they want to accelerate it, senior management tells us to do so, we will, but then something else will fall off our plate, but that's fine. We'll set 4 months as our benchmark. So what would be some actions or initiatives associated with that? You've got to appoint a team, and you have to have some form of database similar to what I was talking about before with the cumulative institutional knowledge, where people can go in and look at it. So let's say that Alumni Affairs is interested in looking at certain demographic populations, and in terms of them applying to colleges. Tom knows that I'm a huge Native American advocate. I asked Tom a couple of years ago, I said, does Worcester get very many Native Americans? And the answer is no, for whatever it's worth. They don't typically go to small liberal arts colleges, so it's not a reflection on Worcester. But it would be pretty interesting to know what's going on there in terms of college applications, et cetera, et cetera. So another action item would be some kind of a mechanism so you know how you're responding to these trends. It's one thing to track them, to identify them, but what are we doing with that information? How is it being shared? That's incredibly important. And then another action item, and now you're getting into a metric, which we'll talk about shortly. How many employees are on their own voluntarily saying, hey, I noticed I was talking to a customer the other day, and one of my competitors was in there before me, and then the customer told me that the competitor's doing this, so I wonder if that signals a trend. That's very, very useful stuff. So you want people, again, with their eyes and ears and antenna up in terms of what's happening in the marketplace. And there's got to be some way of funneling that into a database and having it being part of decisions. You don't want to be making decisions absent that kind of information. And that happens a lot because it doesn't get to the right people.
Hey, Marty, do you actually see organizations building into performance evaluations, people who are submitting these observations, or ways to incentivize people who submit observations for these industry trends?
Great question. I don't see it in performance reviews. Although you can fold it under something like if the performance reviews were done by certain characteristics, being proactive or being market facing, something like that, you could roll it up into that. Now, incentives, the second part, Tom, absolutely. So I used to give, and this isn't necessarily a market dynamics that was internally focused, but it accomplished the same thing. I was working for a company that was, let me put it nicely, we were not making any money. So I wanted ideas from people on how to save money. So I said, we said every quarter, I said, whoever has the best idea to save money is going to get a $250 gift certificate. And I said, don't think that I'm going to just give this to my friends or directors or VPs. It can be anybody. And literally the first time we did it, the best idea came from a shipping receiving clerk who I'd never even met. And he said, I can't remember exactly what it was. He goes, right now we do this and this. If we did this, we'd save a lot of money. And I remember going to his boss's boss's boss, the VP of Ops, and goes, has he ever told you that? And he said, no, but it's a heck of an idea. And so we gave him the prize. So you can absolutely incentivize people with those spot types of things, Tom. It's a little tougher with performance reviews, but you could encourage it. Okay. Let's talk about implementation, which is the next step. So I think it's, the reality is you kind of have to sell this internally. You want to launch it. You want to make people aware that, hey, we're serious about becoming more adaptable. So, I know you think we're doing too much already, but this is super important. So, and you want to, it helps when you're launching things to kind of have little giveaways, t-shirts, hats, coffee mugs, whatever. I call them artifacts, because that way, especially if it's something that sits on their desk every day, mouse pads are great. They see it every day, they're going to remember it. I'm a big fan of that. And I think the other thing that's incredibly important is if you don't start with why, and you probably all heard that, you're less likely to get the buy-in. So always start with why. I didn't make that concept up, but I'm a big fan of it. And then you do want to, and this is part of implementation, train people on how the process will work. So, maybe you want to, like Tom would appoint, maybe a couple of folks within his department to kind of be his SWAT team. Now, if you have a small department, you can have everybody involved, but if you've got a larger organization, you kind of want to have a SWAT team that's, kind of taking the lead. That generally helps. Okay. Final step is tracking, reporting, and evaluation. I think regular reviews are essential. I think quarterly is probably fine. And you want to be saying, what have we learned so far? What's working, what's not? We talked about that before. This is a very important point, and it's one of my favorite expressions. Avoid the extremes. Do not make radical changes every time you're 1% off what you thought you'd be. The opposite extreme is it's abundantly clear something's not working, you're not making any progress at all, and you ignore it and say, we'll give it another year and see if it gets better. You want to be somewhere in the middle. So you want to have a process defined, a mini process by which you know when you should make adjustments and when you should not. And similar to what I said before, you want to have 3 or 4 kind of parameters or criteria for how you decide. It could be degree that we're off where we thought we'd be. You need to decide if it's an anomaly or not, because sometimes if it's an anomaly based on something outside your control, you give it another 3 months. You want to define that so you're not too arbitrary. Obviously, you want to know what's causing. There will always be a variance. Okay, most of the time you won't quite get to where you wanted to be, or something came up you didn't expect. That's fine. That's normal. But those are variances, and you want to understand what caused those. And sometimes you're just going to have to make an adjustment, but a lot of times, give it another 3 months. There's not a super hurry. You don't want to wait a year, but sometimes things take longer than you thought. You just want to, again, give it a little more time before making a change. And again, if you can define this is when we will make adjustments and when we will not, if everybody understands that, you will be much more efficient in how this part of the process works. Okay. So let me give you some sample metrics. And then at the end, Tom, I'd like to see if some folks have some other examples they could come up with, because I'm sure they can.
Yeah, I think after this, Marty, we can kind of open it up to, we can unmute.
Oh, we can do it real time. That's fine. Let me go through these, and then, yeah, that's a good idea. So one is, how much time does it take to recognize a trend? I talked about that before. So that goes to an adaptability indicator, but then the actual amount of time would be the metric. And I talked about this earlier, how much time to respond. Another would just be, what were the scores on our self-assessment when we rated ourselves according to certain adaptability indicators? Number of employees offering suggestions. Let's say before this program, on average, Tom was getting 4 suggestions a month from his folks, or maybe from other departments. After he launches this internally, and maybe it's shared with other departments in Worcester, all of a sudden he's getting 12, and all of them are useful. That's great progress. How about the number of instances when a competitor moved more quickly than you? That is a sign of lack of adaptability. And that's something you have to kind of do a little research on. But again, if you have your eyes and ears to the marketplace, you'll pick up on that. Again, it might not be precise, but you'll have a sense. Now, here's an interesting one. A lot of organizations are doing too much change. This causes change fatigue. People get burned out. Because anytime you're managing multiple forms of change, there has to be tempo. Tempo is too often ignored. It's incredibly important. There's a right speed and a wrong speed, and that is situation dependent. And you have to understand the attitude and aptitude of your people to process change. So if you're getting a lot of complaints about change fatigue, that's not good, obviously, and you want to reduce those. Now, here's another one that's very interesting. You're always going to get customer complaints. What percent are due to old processes that haven't been updated in 15 years that no longer work? Because if you're getting a high percentage of those and a high number, you probably haven't adapted. So let's open it up. Anybody have some other ones for their organization?
All right, so let me take a moment here to allow folks to unmute themselves.
So I'm going to cheat, Tom.
Okay.
A very dear friend of mine joined a little late. He just got his COVID shot. His name is Dr. Charles Booth, AKA Chuck. He is a professor of marine biology at Eastern Connecticut State University. So let's take an example for him. How long does it take the marine biology department at Eastern Connecticut State University to decide to offer a new course? So Dr. Booth, AKA Chuck, how long does it take?
The recent trend has been months, if not years or two, partly because of change fatigue. I was
Okay.
listening, trying to see if what you were saying is relevant to my situation, but we have over the years had a continual influx of new either president or vice president, provost or dean, and they're all trying to make their mark. And so they try to implement some radical new change that takes a lot of time and energy, and then they move on to another job.
Right.
So
Too
we've been
fast,
kind
too
of,
often.
we've been in flux, getting sidetracked with new initiatives that get handed down, pushed upon us. And it makes it difficult to make small changes in our local level because there are big changes in the works at the higher level.
Well, sounds to me like it's time to retire. So I have to state for the record that I did not brief Chuck beforehand, because I didn't think he was going to be able to make it. So it's nice of him that he joined us. But I knew once I saw him join, that's a perfect example within an academic environment. How long does it take to get a new course approved and implemented? And I'm glad he shared the fact that they're going through change fatigue, which it happens when you got new people at the top, because he's 100% right. They all want to leave their mark. They may only be there 2 years, so they're fast and furious and drive everybody crazy. So other examples. Thank you, Chuck. Other examples.
So folks should be able to unmute themselves. If you can't, maybe raise your hand and I can manually unmute you. Can folks unmute?
So it looks like Katie and Jean are still muted. There's Katie.
Yeah, I can unmute.
Okay.
I don't know if
Casey,
other
Jean-
people can.
Yeah,
Casey,
Jean.
can you
There's
unmute?
Jean. Okay, that's the only people I can see, by the way.
Yeah, we can unmute. I'm just not sure if anybody, it looks like everybody can.
Perfect. Casey, would you like to go first? You got some ideas and thoughts?
I just keep thinking about this era that we're living in because we've had to so dramatically change our culture. We were already an adaptable culture, fortunately, but we've had to become even more adaptable. And so what's been going through my mind this entire presentation, which was really excellent, Marty, thank you.
Thank you.
Is how do we adapt our adaptability in this even more rapidly changing environment? Because we're looking at such shorter time frames to respond to new strategy, to move more quickly than we already are. So, I used to think years out in terms of planning. Now I think months out in terms of planning because I don't know what tomorrow will bring, let alone a few months out. And we happen to be an organization that's focused on events, in-person events. So we've had to change our entire business model. And we're also thinking about what that looks like when we're able to return to in-person events. So, within our organization, when I think about, how our team, for example, all of them have their heads on a swivel and are looking at what different organizations are doing or bringing us ideas. And we're trying not to become overwhelmed with all the possibilities out there, trying to fit what will go best with our own business model and will go best to suit our mission for our constituents. So so I don't really have specific examples to offer here other than to say all of this feels very relevant except for the part of the time frames we're dealing with right now.
So Casey, forgive me, you work for, is it pronounced Usenex?
Usenix, yes.
Usenex. So that's for the rest of you. I did a little homework. Fascinating association focused on advanced computing. Jump in here, Casey, if I'm misrepresenting.
No, that's
And
accurate.
on top of everything else Casey said, I think it's fair to say advanced computing is not exactly the slowest moving marketplace there is. I mean, so, add that to the mix. So here's a suggestion, Casey. Given that your primary business model is events, how long does it take you to determine what topics you will cover? How long does it take you to identify a topic that has not previously been covered? Those would be some examples.
Sure. Usually that's within months of hearing about something for the first time. So the industry dictates what topics are relevant, and then we have to figure out how popular they are. And we move very quickly when it comes to that.
That's good.
We used to move more quickly than we can now because we've had to reduce our staff, just compress everything to respond to what's going on in the economy right now. So instead of, so I would say within months in the past, now we're trying to figure out what topics do we maintain, what are the most relevant to the most number of people to survive and then become sustainable again when the economy recovers.
And are your constituents companies, individuals, or both?
Both.
Okay. Yeah, well, I could talk to Casey for 2 hours, but I'd be interested in how you grow membership too. So that's another thing, that how quickly you come up with new ideas to expand your membership. You don't need to answer that, but it's an example of another metric.
Sure. Yeah, those are great. Those are great points. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else, Tom?
Marty, Wasi had a question, who's actually joining us from Pakistan. So it's
Wow.
5:30 a.m. So special welcome.
Wow.
But Marty, if you could comment a little bit about the difference between adaptability and agility, and how do you see those two being slightly different or maybe the same?
Well, great question. I like to define adaptability as agility plus resilience. So I define agility as the ability to change direction quickly while maintaining balance, which is the athlete analogy. But when a company realizes, first of all, they recognize it quickly, they make a decision quickly, but again, speed is not the only consideration. It's quickly, but intelligently. And as they change direction, they maintain their balance. So they don't lose sight of what's sustained them to that point. They build on that. They leverage what they're good at. They don't get so distracted by the new direction that other things fall apart. So it's the ability to change direction quickly while maintaining balance, which again would be an athlete. And then resilience is very simply the ability to bounce back. And so those two things from some kind of disappointment or failure, which every organization experiences. And if you operate in fear of ever making a mistake, that's a death sentence. I mean, so many experts say that you have to fail and get up and learn from it and keep going, and that's how you get better. So again, I think that the best way to think of adaptability is agility plus resilience. Does that answer your question, Tom?
No. I've got other questions, but I will leave it open to the group for others.
How about Wasi? Did Wasi have a question?
That's actually, can you guys hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Hey, thanks for hosting this, Marty, Tom, really appreciate this. Still early here in Karachi. Yeah, but glad to be here, and thank you for answering my question. I think commenting a little bit on agility, I'd highly recommend to everyone, particularly those working in more entrepreneurial environments such as the high-tech industry, to try and tune in to Masters of Scale. It's a podcast hosted by Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn fame, and now currently with Greylock Partners, the venture capital firm. He emphasizes a lot on speed, but I think that's more relevant to industries such as high tech, particularly application development. If you move into the semiconductor industry,
Sure.
So I think that's definitely worth listening to. I personally learn a lot by listening to the podcast.
And Agile is, of course, an acronym used in R&D, the R&D world, technology development, typically software, where it's actually exactly what Wasi's talking about, being as efficient and fast as possible. It's a methodology.
One of the things I wanted to touch base upon is, when you rightfully pointed out the need for competitive analytics. My background originally is investment banking, but now I work as an independent trainer, mostly for non-technical trainings on the management side. So very small scale work along the lines of what Marty does, hence my inspiration for joining this workshop. I've noticed that generally competitive scans or competitive analytics, as crucial as they are, as rightfully Marty pointed out, are kind of looked down upon as a non-core function in organizations. Although, like we talked about in industries like high technology, also in banking, they're very, very important. But my experience is that generally they're looked as a non-core function, and also the output is mainly coming up with maybe Me Too products as opposed to developing a culture of innovation, which obviously, in order to survive over the long term, is very critical.
I've had that same observation, Wasi. They don't put it in the right perspective, and they don't do it for the right reasons, and therefore senior management doesn't necessarily view it as a priority. But if it's used to facilitate innovation, then it adds a lot of value.
That's good to know. I must be thinking along the right lines for a change.
No, I think we are very much in sync. Anyone else, Tom? Thank you for that, Wasi.
Thank you.
Other questions from the group, ideas?
We have a couple more slides, but we're real close. Let me run through the rest of these, and then we kind of do the takeaways.
Yeah.
So here's some kind of tips. This is going to take time, and so you want to set the expectation. But if you stay with it and you kind of, do it in small bites, you will absolutely see progress. I mentioned earlier, you want to have a sense of urgency, but you can't overwhelm people. So I made the point about tempo and just, appetite. So, keeping your foot on the gas is very important, because if you'll probably experience some early momentum, but you got to keep it up. Don't let it fizzle out because another priority arose. I've talked enough about tempo, that's situation dependent, and you must keep your eye on morale. Chuck talked about the change fatigue at Eastern Connecticut. Something like that can affect morale. It's unavoidable. It's human nature. So tempo and morale, I think, are related somewhat. And as you see improvements, share the successes, reward people, make a big deal out of it. It's a positive feeling. It motivates people. It's good stuff. So the keys to success, as we kind of step back and say, okay, what are kind of the main points here? You want to manage this whole adaptability imperative, I call it. And I like the word imperative because it means what you must do. I happen to think it's something that everybody should do, at least. You want to do it strategically and with consistent discipline. Strategically meaning looking long term, but you've got to execute regularly with discipline, do your regular consistent reviews, etc. Vision, you can articulate it, you can have your whole team participate in developing it, that's great, but you got to remind people of it, and you got to reinforce it in everything you do. And maybe you put it on the back of the business cards, or maybe you have a little placard for the desk, but if you want to embed it, people have to have it in front of them frequently, and always remind people of why, because it's easy to lose enthusiasm when other things come up. And in terms of managing, you want to reward, and there's different ways to do that. You can acknowledge it, there's other things, but the people that are buying in and embracing it, and at some point you've got to make an example of people who don't. I joined this company, and it was bad, in dire need of culture change. And there was one individual there who ran the tech support team, and he was the most knowledgeable person in the whole company, in tremendous product knowledge. He had a team of about 8 young people, but he just had this mindset of all customers are stupid. And he thought that because he knew more about the products than they did. That's fine, but you can't think that way. And I don't want the young people that work for you getting that attitude, because then our customers are going to hate us. So I sat him down one day and I said, we have to change. He goes, you're right. I get it. I'm too old. I can't do it. And I said, so you ready to retire? He said, yes. And I went, bye-bye. So because, because if not, I would have showed him the door in not as nice a way. Because you got to make an example of some people. And I think everybody in the company knew what he was like. And so when they saw him leave, and we did it amicably, I had people come up to me and go, oh boy, he was kind of a downer. He just had this terrible attitude towards customers. So sometimes you do have to do that. And then I believe it's everybody's job to try to create that conducive culture, to enhance the culture. So when you define it, it's everybody's job. And then again, those people that make a concerted effort to do that should be acknowledged and noted in some way. So summary and conclusions. I think at all different levels of the organization and for individuals, it can be improved. It is not fixed. And it's an ongoing thing, as I said. I think especially because of the complexity of today's environment, it's incredibly important. You want to think of it as a mission critical asset. And so you want to manage it accordingly. That's why we made reference to all these databases as an example. And then when you develop the mindset and the skill through this step-by-step process we discussed, it's going to enhance your long-term viability as an organization, which you should never take for granted. The other thing is it will give you a competitive advantage. If you're better at being adaptable than your competitors, you're going to win. Because with adaptability comes innovation, as Wasi was saying, and if you innovate, intelligently, you're going to win. So, any questions, comments? You want to do takeaways, Tom? What would you like to do?
Yeah, I would certainly welcome, we've got just a few minutes left here before 8:30. One question I had, Marty, that, and certainly if others have questions, jump in here, but this idea that, both you and Wasi and Casey mentioned that could be industry, but also just personalities within a team that you're managing, which is this idea for constant innovation, constant new ideas. We should go here. And then as soon as we get close to here, we should go here. And then we should go here. How do you as a manager, you talked about discipline and balance. How do you really enact that when you have a team that may be based on personality or the industry influences is constantly trying to innovate and go from one place to the next, maybe not necessarily getting to that vision of or desired change where you want to be as a manager? How do you balance that? So
that's another great question. And that's why you heard me emphasize, multiple times, you have to have a manageable number. Mm-hmm. So it goes to the point made earlier about avoid the extremes. So I think you want to set expectations, say, look, I love that you folks are coming up with these new ideas all the time. These are great. I'm sure you understand we cannot implement probably even half of these because talk about change fatigue. So let's make sure we strike the right balance, which is essentially what you just said. So on one hand, I want to encourage these new ideas. It's an important mindset to have. However, these are the priorities of the department. We have to stay focused on those. And when there's a new idea that comes up that adds value to those or that could potentially replace those, great. We'll vet that and we may do it. But we have finite resources. We want to make sure that whatever we do is done well. One of my favorite quotes is, what you do, you must do well. So at some point, you've got to turn off the faucet, but at the same time, not discourage them from having that mindset. And a key thing there, Tom, on an ongoing basis as management is just check in. So when you have your weekly staff meeting, say, guys, how are you feeling about the tempo here? Are we doing too much? Are we stagnant? It's a sanity check, I call it. But I don't think you have to do it weekly, but you need to keep an eye on that as a manager.
Excellent. Other questions that folks may have in the few minutes that we have left? Well, I might need to unmute folks. I know a few people had to leave, but message saying some really great takeaways here.
Oh, very good. Yeah, you want to share those real quick, Tom, if you don't mind?
Yeah, certainly. Several folks were just, we had, I think, 2 folks who had left already, but just, appreciative of the process, right? Of, identifying that it's not just about trying to, creating change in a culture takes time, but you have to be deliberate in the way you go about that.
Good word is deliberate. Good word. I think deliberate implies discipline too, I think. And it's got to be a structured process, kind of a flow chart type of thing. But yeah, that's the biggest myth out there is, well, culture doesn't lend itself to a process. And I'm here to say I think it does.
Yeah, and I think exactly what you've given us tonight are some really, step-by-step ways that we as managers and leaders within our organizations can actually, kind of chip away at changing that culture in a real measurable way, which is, as you pointed out, something we all talk about, but it's not necessarily something we continue to come back to. What I also picked up on some of the folks, it's about institutionalizing and creating it as part of your daily or regular process that you keep checking in on how we're doing, versus this idea that maybe once or twice or every quarter we're going to talk about organizational change, we're going to talk about culture, we're going to talk about where our industry is going. But if we don't keep coming back to that on a regular basis, we easily lose track and get, sidetracked or fall within our silos, and then we don't see much change.
You're 100% right. And I have to tell you something, and you're going to laugh at this, my friend. So one of my favorite little acronyms, and it's probably the silliest acronym I've ever made up, and yet it's apt in many ways. I call them TOMS, which are top of mind. And so I always tell folks you need to have 3 TOMS, and they can kind of evolve over time, but you want to think of them as a filter in the front of your brain so that everything that you are confronted with on a day-to-day basis goes through those filters so that you never lose sight of them. And one of those, in my opinion, should be culture.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. I might disagree with you on the fact that you need 3 TOMs, judging my
I was
own.
literally just going to say, those of us that work with Tom can only handle one.
But I agree with the top of mind.
It
for
just
sure.
happened to be his name, the acronym top of mind. What can I say?
It's a great, certainly.
I'll call them filters just so Tom doesn't get a swelled head. How's that?
Well, I know we're at 8:30. Marty, thank you so much for this. I
My
know
pleasure.
based on, some of the comments, some of the direct messages I've received, and certainly based on the head nodding and people, going along, this was a fantastic summary of
My
really
pleasure.
great information. We appreciate it so much.
Happy
Thank
to
you to
do it.
everyone joining us. We will send out this video so that you can certainly take a look, go back, look through the PowerPoint slide, make some additional notes. So thank you so much, Marty. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks,
We look forward
everyone.
to, seeing you all soon. And until then, be safe, take care. And
Good luck. Stay safe.
the right way that Marty said, go Scots here at the end. So
Take
we'll see you
care,
all soon.
everyone.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, Marty.
All righty. Take care.